Greetings, everyone. I want to talk with you about a framework that's been around for a couple of years that people have been moving to, especially with the migration and the mode that we've been working with our users through the COVID pandemic. We've transformed almost overnight to a situation where the bulk of our users are accessing all of our data from off-premise and in a lot of various locations. So the traditional model of security is no longer sufficient to really address how we provide our business resources or let people gain access securely and meet all of the compliance requirements that we need to. In the past, we operated by having a on-campus network, and we were able to protect the network access through firewalls, through managing all of the workstations, only installing applications that were approved by the districts, and basically locking things down to a hygiene state where we felt comfortable and that internally everything was safe. Now the corporate network has expanded outside the campus network. Not only our users, but our data has moved outside the network as well. So we're trying to manage the access, the applications, and these different elements from all over the place, basically. So this is how the zero trust security model evolved to address these expanding set of attack vectors. So the premise of zero trust is to verify explicitly, apply least permissions, and always assume breach. Instead of assuming everything behind the corporate firewall is safe, the zero trust model assumes breach and verifies each request as though it originates from an open network, regardless whether the request or resource it accesses through zero trust. It teaches us to never trust, always verify. Every access request is fully authenticated, authorized, and encrypted before granting access. A micro-segmentation and least privilege access principles are applied to minimize lateral movement within the network, and rich intelligence and analytics are used to detect and respond to anomalies in real time. So verify explicitly. We always authenticate and authorize based on all the available data points, including user identity, location, device health, service or workload, data classification, and anomalies. Using least privilege access, limit access to users to just-in-time access and just enough access, and have a risk-based adaptive policy and data protection to help secure both data and productivity. And then assume breach. We want to try to assume that at some point breaches will occur, and so that we try our best to minimize the blast radius and segment access through limiting permissions, microsegmentation of networks, and verifying end-to-end encryption use analytics to get visibility to drive the threat detection and improve our defenses and response. So the zero trust is established on a control plane of 6 different elements. And a lot of the security mechanisms within these elements are pretty common, and they're well known, and people have been using them for a while. Now it's just the idea of trying to pull all this great information together and use these different events in correlation to establish policies and to respond. So we have identity, endpoints, data, applications, infrastructure, and network. So identity, we're trying to verify that only the people, the devices, the processes we have that have been granted access to our resources can access them. And this is our students, our staff, our faculty, the public, um, devices that we own, devices that are personally owned, and processes that are run within the system to exchange information automatically to make sure that the processes are identified themselves as well. Device endpoints, where the security compliance of the hardware accessing your data is assessed, including Internet of Things systems at the edge. So all of these devices where the data is being transferred through or stored, these endpoints need to be assessed, and they need to follow different hygiene practices to ensure security and compliance. The data itself, the data is now stored in a variety of different places, whether it's on a mobile device, a desktop, in the cloud, in a folder structure through a software as a service, whether it's structured or unstructured data, wherever it resides, we need to be able to identify the data and the risk and the classification of data where it's located. This applies to our applications to Zero Trust, whether the applications are local or whether the applications are in the cloud, because the applications are the software level entry points to our information. So if our applications are not trusted or they're not secured, then we could end up leaking data. Our infrastructure, we're hosting data both on premise and in the cloud. The infrastructure can be physical or virtual. It can be containers or microservices, and the underlying operating systems and firmware that comprise the infrastructure. These are all different risk vectors that have to be addressed. The network protections that we put in place help determine our zero trust model and are part of the puzzle that we put together to identify the secure access, especially networks within our campus perimeter where data is stored. We want to make sure that the network in front of the data is what's inspected and that visibility is really gained to make sure that we know how the information is transferring. So as a recap, each of these layers are important links in the end-to-end chain of zero trust, and each can be exploited by malicious actors or inadvertently by users as entry points or channels to leak sensitive information. So one of the core things with zero trust and security in general too is to try to implement a model that's not disruptive to users, because if it is disruptive, users are going to try to figure out ways around the security in order to be able to do their job. So this needs to be a business enabling model that we can make sure that the secure thing is the easy thing to do, and not that it's so complex that it's going to be a deterrent or a frustration where people, will not be able to follow the policies by, having unique passwords for different services, or to be able to protect our identities adequately. Another key to zero trust is having end-to-end visibility. So bringing all of these 6 different vectors together to assess policy decisions, to look at for threat intelligence, to identify risk detection and evaluate access requests and automate responses. So with Microsoft 365 and Azure, the platforms were designed with zero trust in mind, so that each of these different vectors could be analyzed at any point within the system to make judgments on different access requests or data movement as a core principle of Microsoft 365 and Azure. And to have best-in-class, built-in and best-in-class controls so that the setup wouldn't be so difficult, and that basically these control services could be turned on and quickly configured in order to be used in order to help deliver a zero trust environment. And these controls can actually be used within the Microsoft environment, and they could be extended to an on-premise environment, or the controls can also be extended to other cloud environments as well, to have policies that are controlling all of the data within the organization, no matter where the data resides. One of the great things about the community college system is the foundation agreements that we have with Microsoft. So with the A3 and the A5 licensing, foundation licensing, we have access to these security systems, such as Azure Active Directory Premium 1, Information Protection Premium 1, Defender for Endpoint, Cloud App Security for Office 365, Microsoft Endpoint Management. All of these different resources are available even at kind of the entry level of A3, which most colleges are. You can extend that also by either getting the Microsoft 365 A5 agreement, or you can add a la carte the Microsoft 365 A5 security and compliance modules in order to get Azure Active Directory Premium 2, Defender for Office 365 Premium 2, Defender for Endpoint Premium 2, Defender for Identity, and more resources within Microsoft Cloud App Security to pull in the information from Azure and Defender for Endpoint, as well as just the Office 365. It also has the compliance solutions for information protection and governance, insider risk management, and e-discovery and audit. It also has a great feature of automatically labeling, where you get set policies that actually label and classify your data as part of the zero trust model and identifying risks within your environment. So what Microsoft does with identity is that in Azure Active Directory, the underlying service assigns identity. It allows you to assign identities and conditional access to people, service accounts, applications and processes, and devices. So each of these can be identified and classified within the Azure Active Directory in a single location. Azure Active Directory provides a single identity control plane with common authentication and authorization services for your cloud-based, can provide for your cloud-based services as well, and your on-premise resources. And through the features that Azure Active Directory has, you can increase the security of your identities and by preventing multiple credentials being used in different locations, with weak passwords spread across different services, universally applying strong authentication methods like passwordless authentication, multi-factor authentication, Windows Hello authentication using biometrics such as fingerprints or facial recognition, and FIDO2 authentication for your users. These are some really big game changers, because the passwordless authentication is using different metrics within your environment to authenticate your users, so that you don't have to worry about weak credentials being passed or being used from different services. A lot of users, because the password complexity is so difficult to remember, people will use the same passwords with their Google Gmail accounts, with their Amazon personal accounts. And when there's a breach to one of these other services, these passwords get compromised and create a vulnerability for the environment. So by using multi-factor authentication, it addresses the password reuse issue. Passwords were tied to 80% of the breaches last year, according to Verizon data breach investigation reports. And like I said, another thing that's gaining favor is to remove the password entirely by using the Microsoft Windows Authenticator, Windows Hello, FIDO identification, which are the fast identification online keys. So in combination with the user location, the user password, you can formulate identity. You can secure the identity much more precisely using all of these different elements. And with the passwordless authentication, it makes it much easier for users to sign in. So if they get a push notification to their Microsoft Authenticator application that asks them to verify whether they're logging in or not based on a two-digit number, they could just click on the number to gain access, rather than having to type in a password or remember a long password to be able to get into a system. With the centralization of the identification within Microsoft Azure, we could create conditional access as well based on the user sign-in, the state or hygiene of their platform, and the sign-in location. We can make point of logon decisions through Zero Trust and enforce access policies in real time to either block access outright, grant access but require additional authentication mechanisms, or limit access to just view only privileges in order to restrict or again limit the damage radius of any kind of exposures. The other element of other vector is endpoints. Not all devices accessing our corporate data now are managed by or owned by the organization. They can represent another weak link in establishing zero trust. So the devices that our staff, faculty, and students are using may not be up to date or protected, or run the risk of data exfiltration from unknown apps or services. So the tool that Microsoft has created to deal with this vector is Microsoft. One of the tools is Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And that's what we can use to configure and enforce policy management for desktops, mobile apps, using Intune MDM, and also browsers. We can control the way that the browsers are accessing the data. through web link security, or we can enforce different policies within browsers in order to access our data. For example, you can prevent work-related data also from being copied and used in other personal apps within mobile devices. So you can determine whether or not someone could cut and paste or screenshot information and send it through social media to cause any kind of data leakage. Also, Microsoft Endpoint Manager, you can make sure that the devices that are installed meet your security and compliance policy requirements, regardless of whether the device is corporate owned or personally owned. Whether the users are connecting from a network perimeter, including over a VPN, or the home network, or a public internet location. All of these different areas can be assessed through accessing with Endpoint Manager. And another extension of this is Microsoft Defender with XDR management controls, which is the extended detection and response. You can identify and contain breaches that are discovered on an endpoint and force the device back into a trustworthy state, whether it's shutting it down or locking down communication to just the tenant, the Microsoft tenant, and then make sure that the any threats that are on the device are removed from the system before, and any patches or updates are applied before the system's allowed to connect back and access resources again. Microsoft's Azure ID, the cloud can also be used as a single identity provider for authenticated sign-on to other cloud services, along with the use of conditional access. And these recommendations also apply to cloud apps and local apps that connect to cloud-based resources as well. So Microsoft on the SaaS side of the house can identify, you can link to other cloud services, and you can identify where your data lives outside of the Microsoft tenant, and still apply the policies and governance to external tenants that you may have within Google, Box, Salesforce. And you can see here's a few of the different integrations on the slide. But through CASB, the Cloud Access Security Broker, you can control and manage data, extend the zero trust footprint outside of your traditional corporate boundaries, where the data is now living in the cloud. And Microsoft Cloud App Security has a catalog of more than 17,000 apps. It can help you discover and manage shadow IT services where someone may be exchanging files on a regular basis with Box that wasn't necessarily reviewed or monitored by the IT department or the security team. And it can show you that there may be student IDs with PII information, social security numbers that are in these external resources, and be able to alert you or to allow the policies to control how they're exchanged within these services. And you could scope how information may be accessed or shared with those services. So you can, for example, use policies to block actions within the cloud apps, such as downloading confidential files or discussing sensitive topics while using unmanaged devices. in this integration again, um, you can have custom integrations that you configure yourself, or you can use one of the catalog of 17,000 different apps that Microsoft has already pre-configured. And another vector, again, is the network. So with modern architectures and hybrid services spanning on-premise and multiple cloud services, virtual networks or VNets and VPNs can be used within the Microsoft environment to ensure encryption and appropriate segmentation of networks and microsegmentation to ensure or limit the blast radius of any type of breach or attack that may occur. So through these features, you can apply microsegmentation to, like I said, limit the blast radius or lateral movement of attacks on your network. So you have entry points and exit egress points within your network that you could stop or create policies to block at any time. Threat protection to harden network perimeters from things like distributed denial of service attacks or brute force attacks. Through each of these egress points to within Microsoft to quickly detect and respond to incidents and ensure that through policies that you're encrypting for all network traffic, whether it's internal, inbound, or outbound traffic. So basically, this is just a graphic to explain that through these different virtual network features, how you can do the microsegmentation and apply layer 3 through layer 7 connectivity policies through all of the different virtual networks that you have, again, to help contain the blast radius. If any of these spokes are exposed or compromised, you can make sure that it's being blocked, the egress of the communication to other virtual networks that where normally the east-west traffic shouldn't be traveling, so you can get that visibility through these configurations and through the monitoring tools. So managing infrastructure also within the cloud and also on premise, you can create configuration policies and for your infrastructure, ensure that you're providing software updates on a regular basis, and you can have policies that will push those out as critical updates are released. You can deploy infrastructure that meets your needs and security and policy requirements within the Microsoft Azure environment. Azure landing zones and blueprints, I don't think is something within the foundation licensing, but these are security policies that you can create and extend outside your environment to other cloud resources to ensure compliance along with cloud up security. It's an extension of it. The Azure Security Center, along with log analytics, configuration software update manager, on-premise cloud control, and cross-platform infrastructure, you can get visibility into all these different systems and store the information within the Azure cloud. Monitoring is critical for detection of vulnerabilities, attacks, and anomalies. Microsoft Defender plus Azure Sentinel provide threat protection for multi-cloud workloads enabling automation, detection, and response. So through the monitoring of the Azure Defender, Microsoft Defender, Office 365 Defender, you can pump all of the logs for this information, and Cloud App Security, you could pump the log for all these information, all these services into Azure Sentinel and have a single point where you could see the ingestion of the different information and use the different policies that Azure Sentinel has to be able to create incidents, to send alert notifications to SOC team members, to be able to also create automated responses to common security threats, to alleviate a lot of the burden that the SOC teams are feeling from having to deal with day-to-day issues that are the outcomes kind of predetermined on which actions you're going to take. So this is a screenshot of Azure Sentinel and some of the common activities that may occur and how they surface through the security intelligence within Azure Sentinel. Suspicious volume shadow copies, suspicious command execution, and this is these the security intelligence is based off of the telemetry and analytics that's pulled together from the different Microsoft Defender suites that pump all the information into Azure Sentinel. So you can get notified, your SOC team can go here and see the filtered information from all of these different resources. Even with the Microsoft Defender from Endpoint, from different suspicious activities that may be occurring within endpoints that are on the campus network, or endpoints that are privately owned by individuals, at unprotected or open internet network connections. Another solution is Azure Purview that allows you to look at the data outside of Microsoft Office 365. It automatically discovers and maps data sitting across your Azure data sources on premise, SaaS data sources, and works with Microsoft Information Protection to help you classify your sensitive information. So basically, Zero Trust is all about understanding, applying the right controls to protect your data, controls to limit data access only to the people and processes that need it, policies that you set along with real-time monitoring that can restrict and block the unwanted sharing of sensitive data and files. For example, with Microsoft Information Protection, you can automate labeling and classification of files and content. Policies are then assigned to the labels to trigger protective actions such as encryption, limiting access, or restricting third-party apps and services. And this is the framework of how Zero Trust can be applied within the Microsoft environment. The foundation of Zero Trust security identities, both human, non-human identities, needs strong authorization, connection from either personal or corporate endpoints with compliant devices together, requesting access based on strong policies grounded in Zero Trust of explicit verification, least privilege access, and assume breach. As unified policy enforcement, the Zero Trust policies intercept the request. They explicitly verify signals from all 6 foundational elements based on policy configuration and enforces least privileged access. Signals can include the role of the user, the location, device compliance, data sensitivity, application sensitivity, and much more. In addition to telemetry and state information, the risk assessment from threat protection feeds into the policy engine to automate response to threats in real time. Policy is enforced at the time of access and continuously evaluated throughout the session. So at the core, the zero trust policy can make assessments and judgments on information requests based on all of these different elements. And it can help establish secure identities to ensure that the right people are getting access to your information. And moving to zero trust doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. You can use a phased approach to close the most exploitable vulnerabilities first, to implement the zero trust model across the 6 layers of defense. So one of the key areas to start off with is identity, and then also with the data classification, so that you know that you can verify the source of the request for access, and you can track where the data is going and who is actually using it. And then along with this, it falls into compliance with different industry standards like NIST compliance model and the CIS 20 compliance model to be able to implement all of these different controls within a zero trust environment through Microsoft. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for your work, for a wonderful presentation. I haven't received any questions related to your presentation, but if I do, I'll have them forwarded to you. Let's take a break.